When the nights grew long, the people feared the moon's silvery face. Rumours began spreading across thatched villages and rugged highlands. The moon was growing restless, and its cycle was threatened by imbalances in the ancient energies that intertwined sky, sea, and land. The earliest sign arrived as a strange distortion in the tides. Each month, the high waters crept in further than before, swallowing farmland and flooding simple huts with frigid salt. Weathered midwives whispered of missing children at the tide line, gleaning only scraps of footprints on damp sand before they vanished into nothing. Over time, shadows on the moon's surface stretched out like inky scars, unsettling night travellers. Some claimed to hear a voice in the gusts of wind that circled lonely hills, a deep, resonant lament. Hermits in crumbling stone huts scrawled frantic glyphs across floors and walls, convinced they had deciphered the cryptic messages from the cosmos. When the next full moon arrived, it glowed blood orange, stirring panic in beasts and mortals alike. In this time of upheaval, an ancient goddess named Gleanna withdrew to an isolated glen, haunted by visions of a monstrous eclipse that would split the moon in half, unleashing chaos upon the mortal world. The goddess was seldom known by name, for the Celtic pantheon was vast, and many of its deities preferred to be felt rather than praised. She was said to dwell on the boundary between dream and waking, glimpsed occasionally at sunrise or twilight, her long braided hair shimmering like rowan leaves in autumn. The bards sung that Gleanna had carried the earliest seeds of life across oceans to new shores, but few had believed those ancient songs until now. In her glen, enchanted rowan trees rose in pale clusters, their berries shimmering in the half-light. Nearby, a waterfall cascaded into a deep, round pool. Gleanna had chosen this sacred place to focus her powers. Here, the veil was thin. Here, the elemental spirits thrived. On a broad, moss-covered stone, Gleanna constructed a small forge from earthen clay. Around the forge, in a half-circle, she placed offerings of raw crystals, tokens gathered from earth, water, fire, and air. A hush fell across the glen as, one by one, other deities and spirits arrived in intangible forms. A swirl of leaves, a curling gust of wind, the glimmer of amber light. They observed in reverent silence as Gleanna prepared to create the talismans. Such forging had not been undertaken for centuries, not since the wars of old, when gods and men clashed over boundary stones and blessings. But now, the danger was beyond mortal understanding. The moon itself was turning malevolent. Gleanna was no stranger to blacksmithery. Once she had been tasked with forging the instruments of healing that turned pestilence away from her people. However, forging artifacts that would restore cosmic balance was a challenge of a different magnitude. She recalled cryptic passages from the earliest days, how the world had been crafted from the swirling elements, each essential to sustaining life, each connected to the celestial bodies. To stabilize the lunar cycle, she would need to channel the primal energies of earth, fire, water, and air into objects potent enough to anchor the moon's orbit. Failure meant that the moon could slip free of its ancient bonds. The devastation would be unspeakable. Carving out a ring of black soil with her finger, Gleanna began her ritual. She called out to the earth first, using the old tongue that had shaped mountains and valleys. A tremor coursed through the glen. Granite boulders shifted, moss parted, and from underground emerged a hunk of shimmering stone, shot through with veins of emerald. Gleanna cradled this stone, feeling the earth's heartbeat as the rock vibrated with latent power. She placed it near the forge, forming the foundation for her first talisman. Next, she called upon fire, though the act choked her with long-dormant fears. Once, she had nearly lost her divine essence to a wildfire that ravaged a forest she loved. Fire was fierce, unpredictable. Working with it was no simple feat, yet she stood ready, bracing her staff, a slender tree branch crowned with a piece of amber. In the old tongue, she entreated the flames. Sparks crackled in mid-air above the forge, swirling into a vortex as the goddess's amber staff gave off a beacon-like glow. A plume of fire burst forth, dancing before Gleanna's eyes, alive with reckless energy. She corralled it carefully, guiding it into the clay forge, which flared bright until it glowed molten red. The elemental watchers stirred. From the water's edge, a ripple of liquid shimmered, and Gliana beckoned, employing gentle yet firm demands. The waterfall's roar briefly diminished as the streams parted. The droplets peeled away, twisting through the air until they congealed into a small sphere of water, floating just above Gliana's outstretched palm. This droplet was no ordinary water. It held the life force of an ever-renewing spring, ancient as the land itself, essential for healing and growth. Then came the sigh of the night wind, the spirit of air. Gliana bowed her head, inviting breezes to swirl around her in ribbons of pale shimmer. The glen smelled suddenly of salt from distant seas, of pine-laced mountain gusts, of ancient meadow blossoms. Carefully, the goddess cupped the swirling air as though she held a dove in her hands. Each element would require her to shape it into a physical form before it could be combined with the others in the forging of the talismans. No mortal eyes beheld how Gliana placed the emerald-veined rock into the forge's center, or how she channeled the fire's heat to melt and reshape it. Her voice rose and fell like the turning of the seasons. Flashes of brilliant color illuminated the darkest corners of the clearing. Once the rock was molten, she poured the orange-hot substance onto a slate slab, its surface etched with runic markings. She took the watery orb in her hand and let it trickle onto the molten stone. A sharp hiss erupted, and steam curled upward. With the steam, Gliana carefully lured the wind she held, guiding the breezes to swirl and swirl until they condensed within the forging. She turned the molten mixture with a sculptor's precision, ending with a glowing raw piece that radiated the harmony of earth, water, and air. But that was not enough. The forging required the fiery essence itself to unite the three. Plunging her hand into the forge, Gliana withdrew a single spark of living flame. She pressed it into the still-hot amalgam. For a breathless moment, the entire clearing darkened, as though the surrounding world had been plunged into a moonless night. Then, in an eruption of light, the first talisman was born. It took the shape of a small, opaque stone set in a milky ring. Swirling colors danced within. Gliana looked upon it with cautious wonder. Her work had just begun. One object, no matter how potent, would be insufficient to contain all the cosmic unrest. She needed multiple talismans to anchor the moon's disordered energies. Knots of tension coiled in her shoulders as she realized the magnitude of the task. The strength of each talisman rose with the complexity of the forging, and forging multiple items would demand more of her divine power each time. Still, she pressed forward. She prayed in earnest for the goddess of the hunt to watch over her, for the spirit of the oak tree to grant her steadfastness. Her second forging required fresh elements, each newly invoked and coaxed forth. But as she worked, each invocation felt heavier. The watchers in the clearing multiplied, old gods of harvest, shadowy guardians of caves. Even Sidhe from their barrow mounds hovered, unseen except by the corner of the eye. They sensed the goddess pouring her essence into creation, and they wondered. Would she triumph or tear open a breach too large to close? Hour by hour, the second, third, and fourth talismans came into being. Each was a small wonder, one shaped like a twisting vine, one appearing as a roiling tide captured in glass, another like a feather made of hammered gold. Gliana found herself gasping in exhaustion, her arms trembling from the exertion. Immortal she might be, but the forging drew on ancient energies, and the personal sacrifice of her own spirit. She felt a deep reverberation in her chest for every talisman completed, as though she had lost a piece of her own heartbeat. By the time she neared the forging of the final talisman, she sensed the moon had grown impatient. Indeed, beyond the glen's canopy, it had taken on a sallow shade of greenish-grey, fringed with ominous red. A creeping sense of dread lingered at the edges of night. Wolves refused to howl, calling quiet, as if frightened to provoke the planet's satellite in its unsteady state. Gliana forced back her fears, focusing her mind on the forging of the final piece, the linchpin among the talismans that would tie into the others and secure the cycle. She gathered the next set of elemental tokens, chanting in a voice barely more than a whisper, as she feared that even speaking summoned too much power. The ground beneath her shuddered. Sudden dizziness seized her, and she collapsed to one knee. Her vision blurred, but she pressed her left palm against the earth, calling for stability. The watchers stirred, concerned. No deity dared interfere, for they knew how delicate the forging was. Disruption could spell chaos. Liana breathed, tried to steady the world spinning around her. She reminded herself of her purpose, to protect life. Images of saffron fields flickered in her mind, alongside children playing beneath rowan trees, fishermen returning home safe, moths dancing around torches at night. The tapestry of mortal existence was worth any price. Summoning her final reserve of strength, she rose and resumed the forging. This time, the forging demanded enormous patience. She shaped the earthen piece, tempered it with water, guided by gentle breezes, then laced it with a sliver of flame. The mixture flared and threatened to crack. If it splintered, the forging would fail. Gliana steadied her trembling fingers, knitting the elemental energies together with invisible threads. Eventually, the stone grew calm and luminous. It emitted a soft hum, reminiscent of a lullaby sung over sleeping children. With trembling relief, Gliana placed it beside the other four. Exhausted and drenched in sweat, the goddess collapsed onto the moss. For a time, she could do nothing but breathe, letting the hush of the glen enfold her. Around her, the watchers retreated into the shadows, as though giving her space to recover. She felt the vibrations of the newly forged talismans resonating in the air, a fragile harmony that could restore the moon's rightful rotation. Yet forging was only part of the great endeavor. She needed to bless these objects and channel their synergy toward the lunar sphere itself. Gradually, Gliana regained her strength. She gathered the 5 talismans in a small pouch, each nestling into the next as if magnetically drawn to one another. She slung the pouch across her shoulder, tightening the strap. Then, using the amber-topped staff as support, she headed up a winding path that emerged from the glen, leading onto high ground. She climbed until she reached the crest of a stony ridge where wind-blown grasses bent beneath an ever-changing breeze. Far below, the sea glinted silver in the moonlight. Above her, the moon hung low, the color of an unripe plum, swirling with eerie radiance that flickered. The goddess raised her staff, letting the amber catch the distant starlight, magnifying it. The talismans in her pouch vibrated, each pulling the next into a resonant chord. Gliana took a deep breath and summoned the old tongue. Her voice at first was weak, but it grew stronger with every syllable, until she was calling out to the moon itself. If thou be out of balance, I shall set thee straight. If thou be raging, I shall calm thee. If thou be lost, I shall guide thee home. Clouds churned across the sky. Thunder rumbled, making the goddess's hair stand on end. She felt a wildness in the moon's aura, as though something monstrous flexed within that spherical form. Nonetheless, Gliana's chant did not falter. Her eyes glowed with a faint luminescent green as she continued. I bind with earth, with water and wind, with raging flame and living spark. Thy cycle is locked, thy path assured. By ancient vow and goddess's mark. Lightning split the night. It struck near Gliana, scorching the ground. She staggered, but inhaled deeply and raised her staff high again. Yet more lightning fell, dancing across the ridge. Wind gusts nearly flung her backward. Through all this, she felt a sharp surge of power from the pouch at her hip. The 5 talismans brightened, each piece emanating a distinct glow, green from earth, blue from water, white from air, red from fire, and golden from the unified essence. Racing herself against the gale, Gliana plucked each talisman out, raising them high. One by one they hovered in the air as she intoned a final chant. When she launched the last words into the night, the talismans shot skyward in a blazing arc, swirling like sparks from a bonfire. Goddess and watchers alike looked on as they ascended toward the swirling storm that enveloped the malformed. A mighty roar of wind and thunder shook the heavens. In a brilliant display, the 5 talismans hammered into the moon's surface, embedding themselves in glowing fissures. Gliana watched with wide, unwavering eyes as the moon crackled with energy. Green, red, gold, blue, and white streaks skittered across its entire surface, knitting themselves into swirling sigils. The moon began to glow, bright and pure, restoring its gentle silver face, but the forces within were not yet subdued. A shriek echoed in the sky, high and piercing. A monstrous silhouette formed against the celestial sphere. The watchers beheld a shape akin to the coiling tail of a giant worm or a serpent writhing across the lunar surface. The glow of the elements intensified. Gliana realized she must perform one last measure to seal away whatever malevolent presence clung there. Planting her staff on the ridge, she summoned the remains of her divine energy. "No destructive will shall remain," she cried to the moon, her voice carrying across land and sea. "Henceforth remain a protector of midnight journeys. Bear your face untainted." A final jolt of lightning speared down from the clouds, striking Gliana's staff. Amber shattered into 1,000 shards, each shard dissolving into sparks of golden light that flew skyward like a stream of stars. The golden stream merged with the swirling sigils on the moon, forming a blazing cage around the writhing shape. With a final roar, the shape dissolved, and the sigils receded as well. Soft silver luminescence returned to the moon, driving away the last vestiges of the malevolent force. Then, total stillness. The clouds parted, revealing a moon that shone alabaster white. Its surface, once marred by bruised colors, now looked tranquil, as if newly cleansed in the cosmic ocean. Gliana collapsed to the ground, the last of her strength utterly spent. Her staff was reduced to a charred branch. She heard a distant, triumphant cry of the watchers, a host of voices chanting gratitude. From the trees to the mountain slopes, from the hollows of rock to the tide-lapped shores, a faint applause stirred the air. Gliana barely perceived soft steps rounding the ridge. Wisps of silent watchers, spirits clad in the shape of starlight. They held out ghostly arms in reverence, forming a ring around the goddess. From somewhere in the heavens came a gentle breeze, carrying the faint hum of the newly anchored orbit. The cataclysm had been averted, at great cost. At dawn, Gliana roused in the hazy new light, her limbs stiff and her throat parched. The watchers were gone. The moon, dimmed by the rising sun, appeared as a pale disk high in the sky. She could sense its renewed stability, its orbit properly tethered. The knowledge gave her a measure of calm. Yet as she surveyed the scattered shards of amber, an ache filled her heart. None of the talismans had returned to her. They now resided in the moon, forming a living barrier against cosmic disturbance. In forging and sacrificing them, Gliana had severed some link to her old powers. She felt newly mortal, though still touched by the divine. Descending from the ridge took longer than she expected. Birds sang in the meadow, a gentle breeze teased her hair. Surveying the land below, Gliana saw that the sea did not encroach as it had before. The tides looked normal once again. Fishing boats pushed into the water, and the smoke from village hearths rose in thin, steady lines. She realized with a pang of relief that life would continue. The threat of the moon's catastrophic cycle had been sealed away. At the foot of the slope, she found a ring of small white flowers blossoming, which had not been there the previous day. Their petals glowed with a faint lunar sheen, as though standing witness to her night's triumph. The goddess paused, kneeling to cup one flower in her hand. A sense of renewal washed over her, along with the sadness of what she had sacrificed. No cosmic victory ever came free of cost, and she accepted that truth now more than ever. She continued onward until she reached the sacred glen. Her makeshift forge lay in disarray. The clay cracked, the stones blackened, the runic markings scuffed by the night's storms. Scattered around were small glints of elemental residue, gleaming in the early sun. Kneeling there, Gliana gently scooped up these traces, tucked them into a fold of her garment, and let herself feel gratitude. These tiny remnants were her mementos, souvenirs of the forging that saved an entire realm from calamitous ruin. Slowly, carefully, she dismantled the damaged forge, returning the space to its natural state. She sprinkled water from the waterfall onto the clay, letting it melt back into the ground. She smoothed the patches of torn moss with her palm, breathing life into them until they sprung upright once more. Then she bowed to the rowan trees, guardians of this patch of holiness, and touched her forehead to the trunk of the nearest one, an offering of thanks. Though the forging was done, the goddess knew the vow to protect the moon would outlast her ephemeral presence. There might come a time when others would notice strange marks or patterns in the lunar surface, glimpsing faint traces of colour swirling in the night sky. They would remark on how the moon sometimes seemed to hum, or how it grew especially bright during certain equinoxes. Should they wonder why, let them. The truth was bound up in old songs that few mortals could decipher anymore. But for her, the story was written on her very soul. Exile or worship might follow. Ancient gods were rarely welcomed back into mortal affairs without suspicion. Yet Gliana did not linger to see. She gathered her staff's remnant, charred though it was, and clutched the piece of wood in her hands. Without the amber, the staff was no more magical than a fallen branch. That might suit her well. Where once she had been brimming with divine might, she now felt the quiet hush of humility. Perhaps she would roam as a protector in plain clothes, healing small wounds, listening to those who spoke of nightmares fueled by darkness. She had discovered that the greatest acts sometimes required giving away a piece of one's power so that life could flourish. Leaving the glen, Gliana trudged down a winding path sprinkled with wildflowers. The sun rose higher, warm rays brushing her shoulders. She did not know what new shape her destiny might take in this world, but she felt a stirring of hope. In the sky, though hidden now by daylight, the moon persisted as a steadfast guardian. Its cyclical dance was secure, guided by the forging of elemental talismans and the goddess who had wrestled the moon to spare the earth from cataclysm. Long after, in the quiet, songs passed between old hearth fires. People spoke of the strange nights when the tides nearly swallowed entire villages. A wandering bard might recount a vision of a figure with braided hair forging wonders in a hidden glen while the sky split open in flickers of flame and wind. Some would shrug, calling it fancy. Others would nod in quiet reverence, feeling an instinctive gratitude that went beyond words. Though the names of the old gods faded and the truth behind each ritual was half forgotten, the world was blessedly safe its moon, calm and faithful in the nocturnal sky. And somewhere, in a humble corner of the land, a certain woman with eyes like twilight would smile at the silver disk overhead, remembering the night when she gave her all so that life might continue. And the moon, at peace, would forever bear silent witness to her vow.